And that's when it really clicked for me. Of course this audience of mainstream suburban kids identified with BLINK-182 because that's who they were. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome to the latest installment of my series called How They Got Big, where, you guessed it, I talk about important bands and do my best to figure out how they got to where they are. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about a band that's been requested more than any other, which is BLINK-182. I've been a huge fan of this band since Enema of the State came out back in '99 or whatever it was. Enema of the State is the album that made me fall in love with this band because it just perfectly captured where I was at in my life at that time. I think I was like 20 or 21 and going through all the same things that they talked about on that album. All the girls I liked didn't like me back, I had no real idea what I was going to do with my life, and mostly just spent my free time going to shows or hanging out with my friends making dick jokes. I fell in love with it instantly, and I've listened to it maybe more than any other album. And that legacy is exactly what I'm talking about in this video. BLINK-182 is one of the biggest and most influential rock bands of the last 20 years. They've sold over 50 million albums worldwide, including 3 Billboard Top 10s. And what's really impressive to me is that at the time I'm making this video, they have 8.5 million monthly listeners on Spotify, which tells me that I am not the only one still listening. So how did BLINK-182 get so big? Well, I've got a few ideas, so let's get into it. Key factor number one is that they were nice, clean-cut kids from the suburbs that were relatable to a mainstream audience. One of the fundamental principles of human psychology is that like attracts like. Basically, that we seek out people who are like us. It's just the way our brains are programmed. And in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons that Blink got so big is because of exactly that, because they're so relatable to a mainstream audience. They're a friendly, accessible version of punk that feels familiar in a way that wasn't really true of so many punk bands who came before them, other than maybe Green Day and The Offspring. This became super clear to me actually while I was researching this video. I watched some old MTV special where they went back to their hometown and talked to Mark and Tom's parents, and I saw that they grew up in these like really nice upper middle class houses in the suburbs of San Diego. And that's when it really clicked for me. Of course this audience of mainstream suburban kids identified with BLINK-182 because that's who they were. Mark and Tom were that suburban kid. The only difference is that they started a punk band. And like I said earlier, like attracts like. And as I talked about in my video about 90s skate punk, this was a big differentiator for them as compared to the previous generation of bigger punk bands like NOFX, Bad Religion, and Social Distortion, among others. They were great bands that definitely struck a chord with people in the punk scene, but they didn't really get traction with a much larger market of mainstream suburban kids who maybe had a bit of a rebellious streak but weren't really part of the punk scene per se. Who is a mainstream suburban kid gonna identify with more? This or this? What it really comes down to is that all three of them are extremely charismatic personalities. Most bands are lucky to have one charismatic personality in the band, and they had 3. And if you've watched my other videos, you may have heard me talk about how important charisma is for bands. That the bands who really break out of pretty much any scene always have that usually very good looking, always very charismatic frontman or woman that's a magnet for the fans to latch onto. Somebody with real star power. A couple obvious examples would be Ollie Sykes, Hayley Williams, and Pete Wentz. And Blink, as I said, had not one but 3 massively charismatic personalities with star power. Tom, Mark, and Travis, any one of them on their own have the looks and the charisma to be a frontman of a big band. It might sound like I'm kind of calling them a pop-punk boy band, and I sort of am, I guess, in a way. Because like the boy bands like NSYNC or Backstreet Boys, a big part of their appeal was that they were cute, non-threatening guys who played really catchy, accessible music that appealed to that giant market of suburban kids who shop at the mall. But the big difference is that unlike NSYNC or Backstreet Boys, this wasn't some cynical, calculated thing where some industry people put it together hoping to get rich. It just kind of happened that way naturally. That was key factor number 1, their charisma and relatability, which brings us to key factor number 2, that they leveraged the power of MTV when MTV was at its peak relevance. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was no bigger platform for an artist to become a star than MTV. Radio was also important, as well as the big rock magazines like Rolling Stone or Spin, but nothing at that time was more powerful than MTV. They were the kingmakers back then in the same way as social media is today. And their breakthrough album, Enema of the State, came out when the MTV show TRL, or Total Request Live, was at its peak. TRL was on every weekday afternoon, and I think they would play like the top 10 videos of the day as voted by fans. They would do interviews, they'd have bands play live, kind of a music variety show with that top 10 countdown at the core. Millions of kids watched this every day after school, and it was the place for a new artist to break through into the mainstream. And while Blink had been getting a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger every year without MTV, it was MTV and in my opinion TRL in particular that turned them into the massive chart-topping stars that they are today. And the reason why TRL catapulted them to fame like that is simply because they had way better music videos than any other punk band. Yes, other punk bands had done a few videos before, not a ton of them, but many of the bigger bands on Fat or Epitaph, but in my opinion, Blink did it better than any other band in the genre. Other punk bands maybe did 1 or 2 videos that were pretty good, but Blink consistently had really, really good videos that showed off their personalities, going all the way back to Dude Ranch. For example, you may have seen the video for the song Josie off that album. That video was just way slicker than pretty much any other punk video at the time, and even has an appearance from Alyssa Milano. But there were 2 videos that I think were specifically responsible for their mainstream success. The first was What's My Age Again, which I'm guessing you're probably familiar with. In case you're not, this is the one where the band is running naked through the streets, and it was just like the perfect concept for the whole like Tony Hawk Pro Skater jackass kind of zeitgeist that was blowing up at the time. What's My Age Again was big, but I think the video for All the Small Things is what really put them over the top. In fact, I would go so far as to say that without that video, they wouldn't be the stars that they are today. The video is basically a parody of a handful of the most popular videos that have been on TRL at the time by Christina Augilera, by Britney Spears, and NSYNC, among a bunch of others. Basically, it was like meme marketing before that was a thing. And if you haven't seen it, or you're too young to get all the references, here's a few like shot-by-shot examples. Backstreet Boys, 98 Degrees, NSYNC, Britney Spears, and Christina Aguilera. All the Small Things was a massive hit that proved they were more than just a one-hit wonder. And of course, a huge part of that was because the song itself was fucking great, but there's another dimension to it that I think is not so obvious but super important. By making a video that referenced all the stuff that was dominating TRL at the time, they signaled to the millions of suburban kids watching TRL like, hey, we're watching the same stuff as you guys are. We're not like those other bands that act like they're too good for this stuff, too cool for school. We're just like you guys and your friends. It really underscored their relatability that I talked about in the previous point. Because although it was a parody of those videos, it wasn't hateful or mean-spirited. It was just kind of them being ridiculous and goofing around. It was more like laughing with the people they parodied, not laughing at them, which again gets back to my previous point about relatability. That was key factor number 2, great videos, when videos were the key to mainstream success, and now we have come to key factor number 3, that their music evolved without losing the original spirit of the band. One of the biggest struggles for any band, or really any creator of any kind, is whether to keep making more of the same thing that made you popular or to branch out and try new things. And the reason I use the word struggle here is because it's really, really hard. There are rarely any clear answers about which direction is right, and a lot of people fuck it up. If you don't change enough, people are going to say that you're boring and repetitive and ran out of ideas. And if you change too much, people are going to complain that you lost the plot and that they wish you'd go back to playing stuff like the first album. And it's super stressful because it feels like you lose either way, but you have to make a choice. And BLINK-182 are one of the few bands that have pulled it off, and I think that's a big part of why they've reached that legendary status and stayed relevant for so long. They've grown with their audience without ever losing sight of what makes Blink Blink. In my opinion, you can broadly divide Blink's career into 3 eras. First, the skatepunk era, which is basically Cheshire Cat and Dude Ranch. And I know the Blink hipsters say that Dude Ranch is the best album, but if I'm being objective, it's pretty hard for me to get behind that statement. You can definitely hear that signature Blink sound developing here and there, and there are a couple genuinely great songs, most notably Dammit, but overall, I think they're pretty far from reaching their potential. The pieces are there, but they just really hadn't quite put them together yet. Second is the pop-punk era, which is Enema of the State and Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. This, in my opinion, is where it really came together, where they really hit their stride in terms of songwriting and production. There's not a single skippable song on Enema of the State, in my opinion, and very, very few bands ever make an album like that. That album is a true classic. And in addition to the songwriting and the production, we of course have to talk about Travis Barker, whose first album with the band was Enema of the State. It's rare for a new drummer to make that much of a difference in a band, but holy shit, it is just a night and day difference with Travis. He wasn't just quote-unquote a new drummer. They went from having someone who was, in my opinion, a pretty bad drummer that held them back musically, to one of the very best rock drummers of all time. His playing added a level of sophistication and interesting little bits of flavor like that samba kind of breakdown on Dysentery Gary. that the average listener wouldn't really consciously notice, but were key to making the songs more than just simple pop-punk tracks. And lastly, what you could call the emo era, which would be the self-titled album Neighborhoods and California. I don't personally like this stuff, but it made a lot of sense because not only were they getting older, and it would be weird for them to write more songs about being 23, but so were their fans. And I don't think this was some sort of calculated plan to like grow with their fans, quote unquote, and be more marketable, but that is exactly what they did. And again, that is much easier said than done. A lot of bands try and a lot of bands fuck it up, so they deserve a lot of credit for pulling it off. And I also want to quickly give a shout out to all their various side projects because I don't think they get nearly enough credit for them. Mark and Tom are not really the greatest players in the world, Travis obviously is, but they are super creative, really strong songwriters, and in their own right, great musicians. I personally like Boxcar Racer the best out of all their side projects, but Transplants are also pretty underrated. As I recall, Transplants was Travis's idea. He said he wanted to make quote unquote drum and bass music for punk kids, I think, which is actually a pretty cool forward-thinking idea. And when I'm in the right mood, I actually really like Angels and Airwaves, even though their songs maybe aren't as strong as BLINK-182's. And although all their albums and side projects sound pretty different from each other, the one common thread of all of them is the same thing, which is great songs. You can always hear their sonic fingerprint on everything they do, which to me is one of the hallmarks of a truly great artist. And that was key factor number 3, their ability to evolve their music over time to grow their audience without ever losing sight of what makes the band what it is. Alright everybody, those are my thoughts on BLINK-182 on how they got so goddamn big. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. Why do you think BLINK-182 got so big? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What made you fall in love with BLINK-182? So let me know in the comments, and with that, I'm going to sign off for now. But if you found this video interesting or entertaining or informative, I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel. If you're already subscribed or for some strange misguided reason you do not want to subscribe, please like the video, leave a comment, share it with a friend. Anything you can do to help spread the word would be very much appreciated. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but as always, I will see you next time.